Bit more about these attacks and the conflict in Yemen more widely. I'm very pleased to be joined now on the line by Elisabeth KENDALL. She's a senior research fellow in Oriental Studies at Oxford University. Thanks very much for your time today. First of all, do you think the UAE will respond to this spate of Houthi attacks?
I think the UAE is going to have to respond, but in a carefully calibrated way. And in fact, its choices are pretty stark. Either it has to increase support to the anti-Houthi offensives going on in Yemen in order to weaken the Houthis once and for all, or it needs to wind down its support for the anti-Houthi offensives in Yemen in order to remove the threat from its own borders. I think there's maybe some evidence that it's trying to do both at the same time. We have seen that it's managed to target the Houthi launch sites inside Yemen, but at the same time, we are hearing reports that the United Arab Emirates-backed forces on the ground in Yemen are pulling back to their headquarters without having fully taken Ma'rib city yet.
Why is it, do you think, that the UAE is being targeted now by the Houthis? I mean, it's worth reiterating that many Emirati troops left the country several years ago, but of course the UAE remains a really influential player in the war.
Yes, that's right. So the UAE did pull back its own forces, most of them from Yemen in 2019. But it's being targeted now because it left many forces, thousands of forces on the ground that it had recruited, trained, armed. And these forces have become more involved recently in the anti-Houthi offensives inside Yemen. So why now? So this is the Houthis' way of taking revenge against the United Arab Emirates and telling it to get out. There might be one further reason. Of course, the Houthis are trying very hard to milk the public relations exercise of this latest attack as part of an anti-Israeli framework. So, yes, they'll take the opportunity there, but there may also be a broader message from Iran, the backer of the Houthis, which says, we want you to yield more and to lift sanctions now. Otherwise, we, via our arms in the region, could destabilize the whole region.
And is that a realistic threat? Do the Houthis have that kind of capacity, or is this simply a lot of rhetoric from the rebels?
Well, it's certainly looking like the Houthis have much greater or faster development of their military capability than was previously thought. The Houthis have said that they have advanced drones which can reach about 2,000 kilometers. So the question must be, who's next? If this is part of an anti-Israeli offensive as well as an offensive inside Yemen, then that leaves a rather broad swathe of the region open to these Houthi attacks.
Indeed, certainly that would be a worrying development if this was to internationalize further. But based on the news that we have today, surely this is really rather bad news just for the UAE. I mean, it prides itself as a hub of business, as a safe place in the Middle East. This doesn't look great image-wise, does it?
No, that's right. This is a blow for the UAE. It's not just the physical harm, which thus far, it's tragic, but it is minimal. It's symbolic and it's psychological, and both of those factors have significant economic knock-on effects. So, the UAE is basing its economy on tourism, on business, investment, and this massively damages that. The Houthis are playing this up too. They're saying to foreigners, you should leave. They're saying to foreign businesses, you should exit the United Arab Emirates. You're no longer safe. And last week, the United States did issue a travel warning to its citizens against going to the UAE. So yes, this has significant implications for the UAE if it continues.
All the while, though, I mean, we mustn't forget the war in Yemen is ongoing. It's been a terrible war going on for the last 7 years now. I mean, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people killed, famine affecting millions. Why is it that nobody has succeeded in negotiating a ceasefire and an end to the conflict?
Well, yes, it's been going on for 7 years. And of course, Yemenis really can't wait. The situation on the ground, the humanitarian crisis, is spiraling. So I think there are three main problems, challenges facing the United Nations mediation team. The first is how to break this cycle of violence. drone attacks end up with retribution airstrikes, which end up with more drone attacks. Second question, how to break the deadlock in the actual political process when both of the main warring sides either feel too strong or too weak to make a deal. And thirdly, most critically, how do the mediators peel away all these complicated international layers to the war so that Yemenis have the opportunity to speak to Yemenis and resolve their differences?
And just finally, I mean, I wonder whether you have the impression that the war in Yemen, something that you, of course, cover very closely, is by and large almost a forgotten conflict on the world stage. It's not a story we hear about very often, even here at France 24. I mean, the UN has called it the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. Why do you think it's not in the news headlines every day?
Good question. I think that we're not seeing the knock-on effects of this yet in Europe. So there are internally displaced people in Yemen, but they're not refugees like from Syria or Libya showing up in Europe. And I think also other things have clouded the agenda. There are other bad crises going on. We've got humanitarian crises of similar proportions in Afghanistan, in Ethiopia. The political attention and bandwidth of our leaders is taken up now with Ukraine, with China. So Yemen tends to be on the back burner until some hard-hitting attack exits over its borders, such as the ones that we're seeing in the UAE recently.
Elisabeth KENDALL from Oxford University, thanks very much indeed for your analysis and your time today.
You're welcome.